The glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Sterling Financial trembled slightly as the morning wind pushed against Manhattan's newest skyscraper. I had been Rachel Morrison for 28 years, but in this moment, staring across the mahogany table at Marcus Sterling, the CEO's brother and our chief operations officer, I felt like I was dissolving into nothing. His designer suit probably cost more than most people made in 3 months, and his perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning light as he leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed, wearing that familiar smirk that had haunted my nightmares for the past 6 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The PowerPoint slide behind him displayed a single, damning number in bold red text, $200 million. Below it, in smaller font, was a list of failed initiatives, botched client relationships, and operational disasters, all bearing Marcus's signature, all projects I had warned him about, all catastrophes I had spent sleepless nights trying to prevent. But there, at the bottom of the slide, in the same corporate blue as our company logo, were 4 words that made my blood run cold. Managed by Rachel Morrison. I felt the familiar knot form in my stomach, the same one that had been growing tighter every day for the past 8 years, as I watched this man systematically destroy everything I had worked to build. Marcus cleared his throat dramatically, and the 12 board members seated around the table turned their attention to him like flowers following the sun. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying that particular blend of arrogance and false concern that I had come to recognize as his signature tone. "We need to address the elephant in the room. Our operational efficiency has declined by 43% over the last 18 months, and client satisfaction scores have hit an all-time low. The common denominator in all these failures is sitting right here at this table." His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the satisfaction dancing in them. Rachel has been with us for nearly a decade, and I think we all know well, let's just say she's become more of an overpaid babysitter than an actual executive. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. Around the table I watched as some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Patricia Chen from Legal studied her manicured nails with sudden fascination. David Kumar from Finance adjusted his glasses and stared at his laptop screen. Even Jennifer Walsh from Marketing, who I had mentored for 3 years, couldn't meet my eyes. The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of traffic 32 floors below and the soft whir of the building's climate control system. I had seen this moment coming for months, maybe even years, but that didn't make it any less devastating. Every late night I had spent fixing Marcus's mistakes. Every weekend I had sacrificed to salvage his failed projects. Every time I had bitten my tongue when he took credit for my work. It all led to this moment. He had systematically painted me as the problem while positioning himself as the solution, and now he was ready to deliver the killing blow. The irony wasn't lost on me that the $200 million in losses he was blaming me for were actually the direct result of his refusal to listen to my warnings, his insistence on pursuing vanity projects, and his complete inability to understand the intricate systems that kept Sterling Financial running. But as I sat there feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes judging me based on lies and manipulation, something inside me began to shift. The fear that had been my constant companion for so many months started to crystallize into something harder, sharper. I thought about my daughter Emma, just starting her sophomore year at Columbia, who looked at me with such pride when she told her friends about her mom, the executive. I thought about the young women I mentored through our company's diversity program, who saw me as proof that they could break through glass ceilings. I thought about the hundreds of employees whose livelihoods depended on the systems I had built, the relationships I had cultivated, the crises I had navigated. Marcus was still talking, his voice rising with theatrical passion as he painted a picture of my incompetence for the board. The Singapore acquisition? Rachel's poor due diligence cost us $60 million. The McKinsey contract? Her inability to manage client relationships lost us our biggest account. The European expansion? Her operational failures set us back 2 years and counting. Each accusation was a masterful distortion of the truth, but I remained silent. my hands folded calmly in my lap. I knew the real story behind every project he mentioned. The Singapore acquisition had been his pet project, and I had warned him repeatedly about the regulatory issues that eventually killed the deal. The McKinsey contract was lost when Marcus insisted on renegotiating terms that the client had explicitly said were non-negotiable. The European expansion was failing because he had refused to invest in the infrastructure I had recommended, opting instead for flashy marketing campaigns that impressed no one. As Marcus continued his character assassination, I found myself remembering the conversation I had overheard 2 weeks earlier. I had been working late, as usual, when I heard voices from Marcus's office. Through the partially open door, I had seen him on a video call with his brother David, Sterling Financial's CEO, and their conversation had revealed the true scope of their plan. "Rachel's too smart," Marcus had said, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "She knows where all the bodies are buried. If we're going to restructure the company the way we want, we need her gone. But it has to look justified." David's response had chilled me to the bone. "Then give us justification, Marcus. Make her the scapegoat for your losses, and we'll handle the rest." The memory of that conversation gave me strength now, even as Marcus reached his crescendo. "I propose," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone, "that we terminate Rachel's employment immediately. The company simply cannot afford to keep someone in such a critical position when they have demonstrated such consistent failure." He paused for dramatic effect, letting his words sink in. "I've already prepared the necessary paperwork, and I believe this action is not just warranted but essential for our company's survival." He gestured to a leather portfolio at his elbow, no doubt containing my termination documents, already prepared and waiting for signatures. But Marcus had made a crucial error in his eagerness to destroy me. He had forgotten that I wasn't just another employee to be discarded. For 8 years, I had been the invisible backbone of Sterling Financial, the person who actually understood how everything worked, who had built the relationships that kept money flowing, who had created the systems that prevented the kind of massive losses Marcus was now attributing to me. He saw me as an obstacle to be removed, but what he didn't realize was that removing me would be like pulling the keystone from an arch. Everything else would come tumbling down. I stood up slowly, my chair rolling silently backward on its wheels. Every eye in the room followed my movement, and I could see the anticipation in Marcus's face. He thought this was his moment of triumph, the moment when I would break down, beg for mercy, or storm out in tears. Instead, I reached into my own briefcase and withdrew a single manila folder, placing it gently on the table in front of me. The folder was unremarkable, but I knew its contents would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Before you ask for any votes," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the suddenly silent room, "I think the board should see the complete picture." I opened the folder and began distributing copies of documents I had been carefully collecting for months. Emails, financial records, project timelines, and most importantly, a detailed analysis showing the true source of Sterling Financial's recent losses. These documents tell a very different story than the one Marcus has presented. They show that every major loss he's attributed to me was actually the direct result of his decisions, made against my explicit recommendations. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as board members began reading, their expressions shifting from skeptical to surprised to deeply concerned. Patricia Chen's eyebrows rose as she read an email chain showing Marcus overriding my warnings about regulatory compliance in the Singapore deal. David Kumar's face went pale as he studied the financial projections I had prepared for the European expansion, projections that Marcus had dismissed as overly cautious. Jennifer Walsh actually gasped audibly when she reached the page showing Marcus's response to my concerns about the McKinsey contract. "Rachel needs to stop being so negative. Sometimes you have to take risks to make money." Marcus's confident smirk was beginning to crack around the edges. "Those documents are taken out of context," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "Rachel is obviously trying to save herself by throwing blame around." But even as he spoke, I could see doubt creeping into the eyes of his supporters on the board. The numbers didn't lie, and the paper trail I had assembled was damning in its clarity. "There's something else you all need to know," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. 2 weeks ago, I overheard a conversation between Marcus and David Sterling. They explicitly discussed framing me for Marcus's failures as a way to clear the path for restructuring the company according to their vision. The room erupted in murmurs and shocked exclamations. Several board members looked directly at Marcus, whose face had now gone completely white. I reached into my folder once more and withdrew a small digital recorder. I've been documenting these conversations for weeks, with legal advice, because I suspected this moment was coming. The recorder was actually empty. I hadn't been able to get clear recordings of their private conversations, but the threat was enough. Marcus's eyes widened in panic, and I could see him calculating whether to call my bluff or accept defeat. "This is outrageous," Marcus sputtered, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "She's obviously fabricated these documents to save her job. You can't possibly believe." But Patricia Chen cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Actually, Marcus, I can believe it," she said, her voice carrying the authority of Sterling Financial's chief legal counsel. "Because 3 months ago I advised Rachel to start documenting everything when you asked me about the legal requirements for terminating a senior executive, for cause. At the time, I thought you were speaking hypothetically." She turned to address the full board. "Based on what I'm seeing here, and based on my own observations over the past year, I believe Rachel's version of events is accurate." The tide in the room had shifted completely. Board members who had been nodding along with Marcus's accusations were now studying the documents I had provided with growing alarm. The $200 million loss figure remained on the screen behind us, but now it told a completely different story. Instead of evidence of my failure, it had become proof of Marcus's incompetence and dishonesty. I looked around the table at faces that had been judging me just minutes earlier, and I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in months. Power. Not the kind of power that comes from title or position, but the deeper, more meaningful power that comes from truth and preparation. For too long, I had allowed Marcus to control the narrative, to paint me as the problem, while he positioned himself as the solution. But narratives can be changed, and I had just proven that truth, properly presented, was far more powerful than lies, no matter how well crafted. "The question before this board," I said, closing my folder with deliberate care, "is not whether to terminate my employment. The question is whether Sterling Financial can afford to keep an executive who has cost the company $200 million while systematically sabotaging the person who was trying to prevent those losses." I let my words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. Because if that's the kind of leadership this company values, then perhaps I'm not the right fit for Sterling Financial after all. The power dynamics in the room had shifted so completely that I could almost feel the change in the air. Marcus, who had entered this meeting as the hunter, had become the hunted. The board members, who had come prepared to witness my execution, were now staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. And I, who had walked in expecting to be destroyed, now stood as the only person in the room with both the moral authority and the practical knowledge to guide Sterling Financial out of the crisis that Marcus's incompetence had created. But as I looked at Marcus's panicked face, I realized that my victory was far from complete. Destroying him would be easy. The evidence I had assembled was overwhelming, and the board was clearly ready to act. But I had learned something important about myself in this moment of crisis. I didn't want to win by destroying someone else, even someone who had tried to destroy me. I wanted to win by building something better, by creating a future where competence mattered more than connections, where truth mattered more than politics, where the people who actually did the work received the recognition they deserved. The meeting was far from over, but I knew that whatever happened next, Marcus Sterling would never again be able to dismiss me as an overpaid babysitter. I had just proven that I was the most dangerous kind of opponent, someone who was both underestimated and fully prepared. The real question wasn't whether I would survive this corporate assassination attempt. I already had. The question was what I would do with the power I had just reclaimed, and whether I would use it to transform Sterling Financial into the kind of company I had always believed it could be. The boardroom felt like a battlefield where the smoke was finally clearing, revealing who had truly won and who had lost everything. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, His earlier confidence completely shattered as board members continued to flip through the damning evidence I had presented. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rustle of papers and the occasional sharp intake of breath as someone discovered another piece of his deception. I remained standing, my hands steady on the back of my chair, watching as the man who had tried to destroy me slowly realized that his own destruction was now inevitable. Patricia Chen was the first to break the silence, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Marcus, these emails show a clear pattern of gross negligence and deliberate misconduct. You've not only cost this company hundreds of millions of dollars, but you've attempted to frame a valuable employee for your own failures." She held up one particularly damning document, an email where Marcus had explicitly overruled my recommendation to delay a major acquisition until due diligence was complete. "This alone is grounds for immediate termination." The other board members began to murmur among themselves, their voices growing louder as the full scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear. David Kumar pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, no doubt informing CEO David Sterling about the shocking turn of events. Jennifer Walsh looked physically ill as she read through the evidence of Marcus's sabotage of the Mackenzie relationship, a client she had personally helped secure for the company years earlier. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from skeptical judgment to righteous anger, and all of it was now directed at the man who had thought himself untouchable. But Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. He stood up abruptly, his chair spinning backward as he pointed an accusatory finger at me. "This is all fabricated," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Rachel has had months to doctor these documents, to create fake email chains, to manufacture evidence. She's clearly been planning this character assassination for weeks." His face was flushed red, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the room's perfect climate control. "You're all being manipulated by someone who's bitter about her own failures." I felt a wave of calm wash over me as I watched his desperate performance. For months I had feared this moment, terrified that his lies would be believed and my truth would be dismissed. But now, standing here with irrefutable evidence in my hands, and a room full of intelligent people who could clearly see the truth, I realized that Marcus's power over me had been largely an illusion. He had controlled the narrative for so long, because I had allowed him to, because I had been too scared to challenge him directly. But fear was a luxury I could no longer afford, especially when the stakes were this high. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice carrying easily across the room despite its soft tone. "The beauty of truth is that it doesn't need to be defended. It simply needs to be revealed." I reached into my briefcase once more and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "These are the original project proposals for every initiative you've blamed me for. They're time-stamped, digitally signed, and stored on our company servers. Anyone can verify their authenticity." I placed the stack on the table with deliberate care. "They show that in every single case I recommended against the course of action that ultimately led to massive losses." The room fell silent again as board members reached for the documents, eager to see this final piece of evidence. I watched their faces as they read, seeing their expressions shift from surprise to understanding to outright fury. These weren't just financial documents. They were a record of my attempts to save the company from Marcus's reckless decision-making, attempts that had been ignored, dismissed, or actively sabotaged. Margaret Foster, the longest-serving board member and someone I had always respected, looked up from the documents with fire in her eyes. "Marcus, according to these records, Rachel warned you explicitly about every single risk that eventually materialized. The Singapore regulatory issues, the Mackenzie contract terms, the European infrastructure requirements. She identified every problem months before they became crises." Her voice was steady but furious. "And your responses to her warnings show a pattern of arrogance and incompetence that I find absolutely stunning." I had expected this moment to feel triumphant, but instead I felt a deep sadness settling in my chest. For 8 years I had worked alongside Marcus, had tried to mentor him, had genuinely hoped that he would grow into the executive role his family connections had handed him. I had watched him make mistake after mistake, had cleaned up crisis after crisis, always believing that eventually he would learn, that eventually he would become the leader Sterling Financial needed. But now I realized that his failures weren't the result of inexperience or poor judgment. They were the product of a fundamental character flaw that no amount of mentoring could fix. The sound of the conference room door opening broke through my contemplation. David Sterling, the CEO, and Marcus's older brother, strode into the room with the confident bearing of a man who had built an empire from nothing. But as he took in the scene, his brother sitting defeated and alone while board members glared at him with undisguised anger, his confidence faltered. He had clearly been expecting to walk into a routine termination meeting where his problematic executive would be quietly removed. Instead, he found his brother facing a corporate firing squad. "What's going on here?" David demanded, his voice carrying the authority of absolute power. But even as he spoke, I could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He was smart enough to recognize when a situation had spiraled completely out of control, and experienced enough to know that the brother he had been protecting was now beyond saving. Patricia Chen stood up, her legal training evident in the way she organized her thoughts before speaking. "David, we've discovered that Marcus has been systematically misrepresenting his failures as Rachel's incompetence. The evidence is overwhelming and indisputable. He's cost this company nearly $200 million through reckless decision-making, and then attempted to frame our most competent executive for his own mistakes." She gestured toward the stack of documents on the table. "We have emails, financial records, project timelines, and recorded conversations that paint a picture of gross misconduct." David's face went pale as he processed the implications. I could practically see the calculations running through his mind: the legal liability, the reputational damage, the financial impact of losing both his brother and his most capable executive in a single devastating scandal. He had spent years building Sterling Financial into a respected institution, and now his family loyalty had threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. But what happened next surprised everyone in the room, including me. Instead of defending his brother or trying to minimize the damage, David Sterling looked directly at me and asked a question that would change everything. "Rachel, what would it take to fix this mess?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. This was the moment I had been unconsciously preparing for throughout my entire career. The moment when I would be asked to step up from the shadows and actually lead. For years, I had been content to work behind the scenes, to be the power behind the throne, to let others take credit while I did the actual work. But now I was being offered something different, the chance to step into the light and take control of my own destiny. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a mantle. "First," I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, "we need to conduct a comprehensive audit of every project Marcus has touched in the last 2 years. We need to identify which initiatives can be salvaged and which need to be abandoned immediately to prevent further losses." I could see David nodding slowly, recognizing the practical wisdom in my approach. "Second," I continued, warming to my theme, "we need to rebuild the relationships that have been damaged by poor communication and broken promises. I have personal relationships with most of our major clients, relationships that Marcus's actions have strained, but not necessarily destroyed. With the right approach, we can rebuild trust and potentially recover some of the accounts we've lost." I paused, knowing that my next words would determine not just the fate of Sterling Financial, but the direction of my own life. "Third, we need to restructure our decision-making processes to ensure that operational expertise has a real voice in strategic planning. Too many of our recent failures could have been prevented if the people who understood the practical implications of our decisions had been empowered to speak up earlier." The room was completely silent as I spoke, but I could feel the energy shifting again. Where moments earlier there had been anger and recrimination, now there was hope and possibility. I was painting a picture of a future where Sterling Financial could not only recover from its recent disasters, but emerge stronger and more successful than ever before. David Sterling studied my face for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his options. He could try to minimize the scandal, quietly remove his brother, and hope that the damage could be contained. Or he could embrace the crisis as an opportunity for transformation, empowering the person who had actually been keeping the company running to take formal control and lead them into a new era. "What position would you need to implement these changes?" he asked finally, and I knew that this was the moment that would define the rest of my career. I had spent so many years being careful, being diplomatic, avoiding conflict and controversy. But standing in that boardroom, surrounded by the wreckage of Marcus's ambitions and the evidence of my own competence, I realized that careful and diplomatic had gotten me nowhere. It was time to be bold, to demand what I was worth, to insist on the authority I needed to actually fix the problems I had been identifying for years. I would need to be appointed Chief Operating Officer with full authority over all operational decisions, I said, my voice steady and clear. I would need a seat on the board of directors and direct reporting relationships with all department heads. And I would need Marcus removed from any position where he could continue to damage the company or undermine the recovery efforts. The silence that followed was deafening, but I didn't flinch or try to soften my demands. I had learned something important in the last hour. When you have leverage, you use it. When you have proven your value, you demand appropriate compensation. When you have the power to save a company, you don't give that power away for free. Margaret Foster was the first to respond, her voice carrying the weight of decades of business experience. "David, this company has been hemorrhaging money and losing clients because we've been putting politics ahead of competence. Rachel has just proven that she's been the only thing standing between Sterling Financial and complete collapse. If we're smart, we'll give her everything she's asking for, and more." One by one, the other board members voiced their agreement. The evidence was too clear, the failures too obvious, and the solution too apparent for any other course of action to make sense. Even Jennifer Walsh, who had been Marcus's strongest supporter, now nodded reluctantly, as she recognized the inevitable. David Sterling looked at his brother one last time, and I could see the pain in his eyes. Family loyalty had always been one of his strongest traits, but he was also a pragmatist who understood that sometimes you have to sacrifice one person to save many others. Marcus had forced him to choose between his brother and his company, and the choice was really no choice at all. "Marcus," David said quietly, his voice heavy with regret, "you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you'll receive the minimum severance required by your contract. Any attempt to contact clients, employees, or media about this situation will result in immediate legal action." Marcus started to protest, but David cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You brought this on yourself, Marcus. Rachel gave you every opportunity to succeed, and you chose to blame her for your own failures instead of learning from them. The evidence is overwhelming, and frankly, you're lucky we're not pursuing criminal charges for fraud and corporate sabotage." As security arrived to escort Marcus from the building, I felt a strange mixture of emotions washing over me. There was satisfaction, certainly, in seeing justice finally served. There was relief that the months of stress and uncertainty were finally over. But there was also sadness for the wasted potential, for the years of friendship and mentorship that had ended in betrayal and destruction. But more than anything else, I felt a sense of possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in my career, I would have the authority to match my responsibility, the power to implement the changes I had been advocating for, the opportunity to prove that competence and integrity could triumph over politics and nepotism. As the boardroom finally emptied and I found myself alone with David Sterling, he turned to me with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of respect, gratitude, and genuine curiosity. "Rachel," he said, "I owe you an apology. I should have seen what was happening earlier. I should have recognized that you were the one actually running this company, while Marcus was taking credit for your work." I nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but I was already thinking ahead to the challenges that lay before us. Sterling Financial was wounded but not dead, damaged but not destroyed. With the right leadership and the right strategy, we could not only recover from Marcus's disasters, but emerge stronger than ever before. The question was whether I had the vision and the courage to lead that transformation. "David," I said, extending my hand for a handshake that would seal our new partnership. Let's get to work. We have a company to save. As I walked out of that boardroom and into my new role as Chief Operating Officer, I realized that Marcus Sterling had actually done me a favor. By trying to destroy me, he had forced me to fight for myself in a way I never had before. By pushing me to the edge, he had shown me reserves of strength and determination I didn't know I possessed. And by underestimating me so completely, he had given me the opportunity to prove not just to him but to myself that I was capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. The overpaid babysitter was dead. In her place stood a leader who had been forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the hammer of truth. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in years I was excited about the future. Sterling Financial had lost $200 million, but it had gained something far more valuable: leadership that couldn't be bought, corrupted, or intimidated. And that, I knew, was worth any price. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.